As much as the baby boomers fought to overturn and rebel against and eventually destroy the American culture that existed before them, one thing that I have always found interesting is how much these same champions of counterculture that sadistically dismembered their heritage and mocked every tradition their parents had gifted them would at the same time romanticize this same culture they worked so hard to undo. In the 1980s and 90s, there were a flurry of television shows and movies that seemed to acknowledge a yearning for something, a not so quiet acknowledgement of a loss that nobody could quite put their finger on, a bitter regret that was much more than anything that could be explained away by the phenomenon of nostalgia. While these homages to a paradise lost forever sometimes included, a little bit of ridicule of their favorite boogeyman, the puritanical patriarchy that always had been the thankless guardians of this now extinct culture, there did exist a recognition, a deep remorse even, that these were the good old days. One of the most popular examples was even called Happy Days. But unfortunately, Pandora's box had already been opened. The genie could not be stuffed back into the bottle. The monster that the baby boomers had unleashed would grow and mutate and seek to preserve itself, something it could never do if everyone was looking back and quietly asking themselves if perhaps, just maybe, they'd made a terrible mistake. After this period of longing that went on for about a decade, it wasn't that long before these fantasies had to be distorted. Something that was easier to do once those who lived through the era grew old and the memories began to fade. After a while, the sadness began to turn into bitterness. And as one might expect, the yearning was replaced with mocking and ridicule, like a spurned lover who finally gets past the grief stage and as a coping mechanism has to convince themselves that there was nothing good about their ex that they once loved. They have to pervert every memory they had of their time together to fit this new narrative that they're better off without them, that they had simply outgrown them. But it wasn't just important for the baby boomers to forget and smear the past they had thrown away to help them survive and get on, although in a very real way, it was about self-preservation. You see, a new generation was growing up now, growing up in a completely different world. The new normal that had been crafted by the baby boomers. A world of broken homes, of a broken society filled with broken people. They had smashed everything with the hammer of revolution without ever bothering to rebuild anything in its place. And now this new generation, raised in the rubble and smoldering ashes of the baby boomers' devastating culture war, they were looking at these images of nuclear families with attentive and loving parents, affordable schools you could pay your tuition just by having a summer job at the corner store. The corner store that didn't have any bulletproof glass, and if you didn't have enough money to pay your bill, it was okay because everyone knew and trusted each other. They lived in communities with a shared culture and history. They knew each other by name. They didn't even lock their front doors. What's more, everyone was happy. And they were happy without drugs, without antidepressants, without casual sex. What would this new generation, exposed to these images, what would they think if they saw this time, this place that now seemed like some kind of mad utopia, and realized that it was gone? Or more importantly, why it was gone. Imagine the terror, the panic that the baby boomers felt standing over the corpse of this beautiful and lost culture. The murder weapon still in their hands, dripping with blood, as Generation X, dazzled by this wonderful paradise that so starkly contrasted the reality they knew, began to slowly piece together what it was that had happened. So like a deer in headlights, the baby boomers, fearing what would happen if they didn't, decided to hide the body. The movie Pleasantville was just one of the many tools they used to bury the body. The campaign weaponized against Generation X. The best way to explain it is that the baby boomers acted the same way a brutal dictator might act. But instead of it being Kim Jong-il banning all Western media in North Korea and telling his people that everyone beyond their borders was in some nightmarish hellscape and that North Korea was the true utopia, something he had to do, because if the people were to discover the truth, they might overthrow him, or worse. The boomers, using the same formula and reasoning, told Generation X that the 1940s and 50s, despite what it might look like on TV, was really a nightmarish hellscape full of misogyny, patriarchy, oppressive religion, and worst of all, whiteness. The baby boomers often explained how they had brought revolution and fought the man, and now these times were the real utopia. They told Gen X this again and again as they subjected them to this never-ending celebration of the free-loving 60s and 70s. And then to make sure it stuck, they institutionalized it with cultural Marxism as part of the curriculum. Pleasantville was written and directed by Gary Ross, who incidentally worked on Ted Kennedy's presidential campaign, as well as the campaigns of Michael Dukakis and both of Bill Clinton's presidential runs. He comes from a Jewish family that's been working in Hollywood for generations and has written and directed several films, including his first film, Big, which he wrote but didn't direct, and most recent film, Ocean's 8, that he both wrote and directed. The movie begins its assault on the baby boomers' murder victim by mocking the era of the 1950s with an over-the-top 1950s sitcom similar to Leave It to Beaver. The name of the town where the husband and wife and 2 children live in their 1950s home that most of you watching would never be able to afford, especially on a single income, in a perfect neighborhood where everyone is happy. We're briefly introduced to this show as we watch a promo that's obviously being played in present day, or because this movie is 20 years old, 1998, on a cable network that plays old TV shows. It's an advertisement for a Pleasantville marathon. After the promo gives us a quick overview of the show, which of course is dripping with irony, making fun of how quaint and backwards the 1950s was, setting the stage for the rest of the movie. The film then quickly contrasts the 1950s pleasantness with shots of 1998 to try to elicit a superior feeling out of the audience. Several quick shots of the new hip America, including a shot of the new edgy fad of the time, which was a tongue ring. We see how different everything is, including the demographics. We're now introduced to our main character, who's kind of a nerdy white kid in suburbia. This is followed by a succession of scenes that kind of paint a very dark future for this young man and the people in his age group. First, we go to a man giving a presentation to the students. He's literally saying what boomers have been unapologetically telling everyone from Gen X through Z for the last 2 decades. Of course, salaries and opportunities are going down. That's why you just need to try harder, kids. And then we go to a classroom where a teacher is telling her class about the dangers of getting AIDS. The panic of heterosexual AIDS was, of course, all the rage back then. There was this big propaganda push to try to tell everyone that heterosexual AIDS was a huge problem. And they did that to increase the funding because the public saw it accurately as mostly a risk that gay people faced, which statistically speaking, it pretty much is. But at the time, it was AIDS this and AIDS that because they needed to scare some money out of the public and they hadn't yet normalized homosexuality. So nobody really felt a real obligation to pay millions of dollars into research into a disease they saw as only affecting a small portion of the population. We then go to another classroom. This teacher is talking about climate change. Back then it was global warming. Wait, nope. It was the ozone layer, where they wrongly predict that by 2010, the global temperature is going to skyrocket and kill everybody. So right away, we had this contrast between this 1950s happy but little cheesy and over-the-top past and this kind of dark, scary present that our main character, David, lives in. Now, after school, we go to David's home in the suburbs. Rows upon rows of McMansions occupied by baby boomers. Now, David is watching an episode of Pleasantville while his single mother baby boomer mom is chatting on the phone about her social life in the kitchen. It's obvious to the viewer that David wants nothing more than to be in that world on the television screen, to have a mother who pays attention to him and a father that, well, a father. This really demonstrates what I'm talking about. There's this generation that this isn't even a memory to them. It's completely foreign to him, but something deep inside him wants to be a part of that. So the next day, David is at school and he's telling his friend about how much he likes Pleasantville and how the TV network is going to play a Pleasantville marathon. There's a trivia contest and he's going to try to win the $1,000 prize. We also meet David's sister, who's a basic thought. Unlike David, who yearns to have a part of the past, she's a complete hedonist. She embraces this new culture, and she invites the cool kid from school to come home to her house afterwards so they can have sex because her baby boomer mom is going out of town to party with some young guy. This, by the way, wasn't exactly atypical. I had a lot of friends that had a similar situation. They had a single mom, they had a big house that their dad, who they never saw, was paying for, and the mom would just leave and party and let them do whatever they wanted in the house. So unfortunately for Generation X, Y, and Z, these are pretty typical kids. So that night they get into a fight over who can use the TV remote, and it breaks, and then magically the doorbell rings and a crazy TV repairman played by Don Knotts, who was a regular in many 1950s TV shows. And after quizzing David on some obscure details about Pleasantville, he reveals a magic remote control. And the magic remote control somehow transports them into the episode of Pleasantville that they're watching. So I know the beginning's pretty cheesy or whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's trying to get them from 1998 into this TV show. It's just a stupid plot device. Don't worry about it. So now they're in this TV show, and they've taken the place of the son and daughter that are in that TV show. And after some discussion, they decide, well, they ought to play along because David knows so much about the show anyway. At first, it seems like it's going to be kind of just your typical fish out of water story, but they immediately go after the fact that this new 1950s mother, who, in sharp contrast to their 1998 baby boomer mom, who is off doing God knows what with her younger man, is attentive and caring. They make fun of the fact that their new mother had prepared breakfast for them by exaggerating the portions to make the idea that their mother making breakfast for them is this completely over the top and insane thing. David's sister, Jennifer, hates this new world and complains endlessly about how she wants to go home and have sex with the guy from school that she invited over. David convinces her to play along, but she only agrees after meeting a cute boy from Pleasantville. So now we get a quick tour of Pleasantville. Nothing bad ever happens. You see, it's very important to exaggerate this aspect of the world. This is how the baby boomers have to deconstruct it. When Generation X looks at this world and they see a utopia, so the only way to tear it down is for the baby boomers to say, yeah, it is a utopia. It's too perfect. Can't you understand? That is why it must be destroyed. And this is where we get to the real troubling aspect of this film. If you've seen my videos before, you know I'm not one of these guys that gets hung up on symbolism or pointing out, secret satanic imagery. And I'm not saying that stuff doesn't exist. It's just not what I do. In fact, I don't think I've even mentioned the concept of Satanism in any of these videos. I'm more of an expert on storytelling and on propaganda. I dissect what the story is telling the audience and how it's trying to inject ideas and themes into your head using propaganda techniques. But this film, in addition to being all the things that I've discussed before, this smearing of the past, hiding the body, is literally satanic. I don't mean that it's evil. I mean it's satanic, as in promoting Satan. This entire movie is the story of the Garden of Eden. And if you doubt what I'm saying now, you won't once we get a little further into this. It is the story of the Garden of Eden, and it's a celebration of Satan convincing Eve to eat from the tree of knowledge and getting cast out of paradise. This is a theme that is central in modern Satanism. In fact, here it is depicted in the satanic monument that was put on display recently in an American courthouse. This is the story. Now, I want you to think about what that means, not just for this movie, but also in the context of what I was talking about with destroying the culture. How could this movie simultaneously be satanic and also be propaganda meant to obscure the past? What does that tell you about the people who are responsible for destroying our culture? That they knew what they had was good, and they purposely destroyed it because, like modern Satanists, they valued exploring evil more than preserving good. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this right now because I think that I've planted that seed, and you're going to see exactly what I'm talking about as we go through the rest of the movie. It's pretty obvious. Okay, so back to the movie. We are in paradise. Everything is way too perfect. Everyone is way too happy. There are no problems at all. That is until David tells Skip that maybe his sister isn't up for going out with him that evening. Now, that is when the first crack begins to form. They have poisoned the well by deviating from the routine that keeps this universe in order. The universe has skipped a gear. Now, worried that this might become a bigger problem if they continue to stray away from the script, David tells his sister that she has to go along with the routine to help preserve the order of the universe. Now, this is a metaphor for something else as well. This is a metaphor for what begins to happen to a society when outsiders come in and don't assimilate. They disrupt the order of things. Now, at first, it's in small, inconsequential ways, and the system will absorb some deviant behavior if the society is strong, but eventually, it begins to cause bigger and bigger problems until it threatens the existence of the society entirely. This is an aspect of the world that this film also exaggerates. It paints the routine as something bad and extremely rigid. It dictates the behavior of the native population to extremes. For example, when David shows up to work a little bit late, we discover that his boss has been stuck wiping the counter for hours and hours because David wasn't there to do his part of the routine, so he got stuck until David arrived. Later that night, Jennifer, who was annoyed with her date treating her respectfully and not trying to have sex with her, which is an odd thing to see considering how nowadays they've perverted the past even further and told us how people like Chip here would have just raped her by now. She demands that he take her to Lover's Lane. In this scene, Jennifer actually rapes Chip by today's definition. I'm not kidding. That's literally what happens. But of course it's okay because she's a woman. Lover's Lane is the Garden of Eden. We will see this again later in the film in a more literal and obvious sense, but Jennifer, in her pursuit for pleasure, has decided to disrupt the universe and just have sex with this boy she just met. And because this is a baby boomer's view of what is good and bad in culture, this is celebrated as the best thing that has ever happened in this paradise. Eve has just taken the apple and given it to Adam. They have now both eaten the forbidden fruit, and the universe is beginning to change. Where there was once black and white, good and evil, new, ambiguous colors are beginning to appear. Now, the subversive force that has entered their universe begins to spread as Skip tells his teammates about the forbidden fruit. And slowly we see the world that was too perfect and too happy. It begins to slip away. David is alarmed when he sees what's happening, and he begs his sister to stop destroying the universe. But Jennifer, who values her own whims and her own wants and her own desires over the good of the society around her, just ignores him. So it's not long before all of the kids are going to the Garden of Eden and partaking of the forbidden fruit. It's all about pleasure seeking and free love, and if it destroys the universe, that's okay. More and more, the subversiveness spreads, but of course, it's good. You see, it's good because it's more vibrant, it's more colorful, it's not this dark, drab black, or even worse, white world that you're a complete idiot if you want. These changes are good because they're different. And these changes don't go unnoticed. It was only a matter of time before the evil white patriarchy caught wind of these differences in their universe. Whenever they show the mayor the embodiment of the white male patriarchy, they frame the shot like an actual comic book villain. Never are we asked, by the way, to walk in his shoes, what he might think of his world being turned upside down. These men who created and maintain this paradise are just automatically evil. Their sin, creating and maintaining a perfect world. The women are also noticing changes, but since women aren't part of the patriarchy, they are the victims. The victims of the perfect world that their patriarchy created for them, trapped in this maddeningly happy existence. And when Jennifer gives the forbidden fruit to her mother by telling her about sex and explaining how to masturbate, the subversive force that she's brought with her into this world strikes again. This time, a tree in their front yard just catches fire. This is a new problem the community has never had to deal with before. David goes and gets the firemen, but they've never actually had to fight a fire before. This was paradise, and there were no fires in paradise. So David shows him how to put out the fire and is given an award by the mayor in this scene, where we also notice the first symbol to overtly call attention to the whiteness of the town. Now, everyone in Pleasantville is white, so it's only natural for the logo on that banner to show two white hands shaking, but it still sticks out because it's a logo that's been used so often in our world to represent multiculturalism, you know, the white and the brown hand shaking, that simply by having two white hands shaking, it sticks out like a sore thumb. This will come into play in more overt ways later in the film, but I just wanted to point it out now. I also want to point out this is part of David's story arc. See, David, in the beginning, he really likes Pleasantville. He likes it the way that it is. I mean, after all, he's a white male. He's being recognized here by the patriarchy for putting out the fire, because the fire was caused by the new subversive forces that are changing the community. He's being tempted to join the evil patriarchy that wants to preserve the existing culture. So now that he's been tempted by the patriarchy, he goes to work and he is tempted by the subversive forces in town. This is where a maddening bit of irony in today's context begins. David discovers that all the books in town are blank until he tells the stories of the books that he's read. That's when the books magically fill in. He's spreading forbidden knowledge into the town, which starts a new trend of people reading. This, of course, is very much frowned upon by the evil patriarchy who doesn't like the free flow of information. You see, even though this was made just 20 years ago, this was when the left fancied themselves the defenders of free speech. How times have changed. The truth is that they only want free speech if it helps them subvert a society. After that, free speech has to go. Now, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Basically, David's mom is forced to wear makeup to hide the fact that now that she's sexually liberated, she's now in color. David brings an art book to his boss at the diner. Almost all of the art is either garbage abstract art or sexual in nature, of course. David is becoming more and more confident and asks a girl out. Jennifer is also changing. She's evolving in the same way the feminism she represents evolved. She's changing from being sexually liberated to wanting to get serious about her education so she can grow up to be a strong, independent woman. Now, of course, that she's turned the universe upside down, she's going to see what other resources she can squeeze out of it. Now we get to the part where David goes on his date, or rather he goes to the Garden of Eden with his date. This is a kind of turning point in this universe and in the film. It's just like the Garden of Eden story in the Bible and in Satanism. Eventually, God finds out his children have been eating the forbidden fruit, and the town is about to be kicked permanently out of paradise. While David is in the Garden of Eden with Eve, his mother, who's walking around, notices some artwork that the diner owner has now started to paint on the windows of the diner and starts an affair with him. Because her husband, the man who helped provide and maintain the paradise, was, of course, part of the evil patriarchy. Never once are the needs of her husband ever even imagined, thought about, considered at a single point ever. Why? Because he's the enemy. He's an evil white male. Now, at the same time, Jennifer, she's had her fun with Skip, and because he's also an evil white male, she rejects him. And because he's just some stupid white guy with no feelings, he walks away, and so what? Just like David's father, who comes home to an empty house for the first time ever, and he wanders through the home not knowing what to do. And now with this crescendo of everything going wrong in the universe, we see unmistakable imagery that should once and for all convince you that this is the Garden of Eden. Eve literally plucks the fruit from the tree and brings it to Adam/David. And that's when God shows up. For the first time in paradise, there is a storm. The rain falls over the entire town, and they are all at once and forever cast out of paradise. David's dad goes and alerts the patriarchy about what's happening. The evil white patriarchy, all lit and framed like comic book villains, are dismissed as reactionary bigots. Their concerns about being, forever thrust out of paradise are completely minimized as one of the men shows them that his wife burnt his shirt, and that's the worst thing that's happened to him. That's the worst thing that happened to these people that maintained a paradise that was perfect, that everyone was happy. They lost it, and really all they lost was, ironed shirts. So you see, the only reason the men wanted to maintain the way things were was so they could have dinner and neatly pressed shirts. The patriarchy is domineering and evil and only wants to preserve paradise because they're oppressing everyone else. Now, the next day, David's mother leaves his dad, her husband of God knows how many years, for the guy she just met and had an affair with. And again, his father, whose only sin was providing a good life for his family and being a good husband and father, is ridiculed and put down. His needs are not as important as his wife's whims. The subversive new culture has completely taken hold, and paradise is gone. And now in this multicultural reality, and I said multicultural, they're all white, but some of the people are now in color. And the filmmakers use this as a not so subtle metaphor for people of color, as we see when David is hassled by some evil white kids that don't like that he has a colored girlfriend. Now the town calls a meeting, no coloreds allowed, of course, and with heavy-handed fascist symbolism, using lighting and framing that looks like it's right out of Triumph of the Will, we see the patriarchy rear its ugly, bigoted head. The symbol of the white hands shaking is more obvious now than ever. These angry fascists, they just don't like the changes because they want their shirts to be ironed. And now they need to stop it because they want their dinner cooked by their wives. Things begin to escalate in town. The white kids even try to lynch David's mother, who is now a person of color. And because he stands up to the white fascists, David himself finally becomes a person of color. And now we return to the complete irony where the white fascists begin to burn the books of the colored people. You know, it amazes me how quickly the left has become a parody of themselves. They are the burners of books. This right here should be all the proof that you should ever need that the left projects. They project this fear on their enemies because that's exactly what they're going to do. And you know this because this is exactly what they started doing 20 years after making this. So understand that. Now, after some clashes, the town holds a trial to see what they should do about these new people of color. This is where the movie copies almost exactly the shots used in the film To Kill a Mockingbird, a movie about racist whites who attempt to imprison an innocent black man. At this point, it's obvious what the film is saying. The real reason the paradise was evil and it had to be destroyed because it was white. And white is intrinsically evil. And it's not until every last white person is changed into a person of color that the town can accept this new culture that subverted their paradise. Whites might have functioned well and been happy in the paradise they built and maintained until the outsiders showed up, the outsiders who didn't like this paradise. But now they have to be eradicated one by one for this new culture, which is incompatible with the whites apparently. I don't know how much clearer the filmmakers could make this. This movie isn't just an excuse for destroying the past or propaganda that seeks to counter that yearning to gain back what was thrown away so carelessly by the baby boomers. It's a blueprint for the future. It's both a confession and a prophecy. Generation X and those that followed never experienced that paradise lost, and they never will. They will slowly be replaced until every last remnant of that world has changed and slipped away forever. This movie is telling you all of that. This movie is telling you that loud and clear, all the while giving a not so subtle nod to Satanism. And the most amazing thing of all of this is they managed to communicate all of this in an easy to swallow package that people paid money to see. And chances are, if you watch this movie, even after you've seen this, they did this so well that if you watch this movie, you might even still laugh at some of the charming jokes. Never again let it be said that the left can't meme. And in this case, the people behind the film and others like them didn't just bury the body. They convinced the younger generation to help them dig the grave. For BlackPilled, I'm Devin Stack. If you like my videos, make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you share. If you'd like to support my videos, you can grab a copy of Day of the Rope. Link is in the description. Or you can go to blackpilled.com/donate, where I'll keep an updated list of different ways you can support these videos.